In this video, I'm going to show you how I scratch built these gas mask wearing wargame miniatures that could fit perfectly into such games as Trench Crusade, 40k, Space Weirdos, Zona Alpha, 5 Parsecs from Home, or many, many others. Welcome to Cheap and Easy Wargaming, where we keep the hobby fun, fast and affordable. So I started this project by doing one of my favourite things, and that's just emptying a box of green plastic army men and having a good rummage. Originally I was just going to make a squad of 5 ordinary infantrymen, but then I came across a figure that looked like a commissar, so I decided to add one of those too. As you can see here, the quality of these army guys does vary considerably depending on what brand you get. And despite some interesting molds, I was just looking for standard First or Second World War type infantry. I prefer skirmish style games rather than larger battles. So here are my 5 lucky volunteers and their commissar. I've only just realised now watching this back that the sniper guy is shooting the commissar in his bandaged shins. Not sure what's going on there. But as far as these models go, as you can see, they're all just pretty standard. Apart from this guy, who from this point on I'm going to call Commissar Trench. There are some quite unsightly mould lines and bits of flash sticking off, so I'm just going to use a blade to get rid of those. I waste some time here cutting flash off the back of their legs without the forethought that they're going to be wearing trench coats anyway, so no one's even going to see that. And to show how much I've changed in the 5 weeks since this channel started, I even used some sandpaper to give a smoother finish to the helmet. And to think I promised myself I wouldn't let fame change me. I was so naive back then. Here I just use a piece of Lego to raise the blade, which will give a straight and uniform cut all the way around the masking tape. And we're going to use this masking tape to wrap around the bottom of the trouser legs. I'm not entirely sure what purpose this is supposed to serve in the game, but anyone that's still watching knows very well that these miniatures are based on the Death Korps of Krieg. And when I googled what the miniatures actually look like, they all have these bandages around their trousers. I'm not massively into the 40k lore, so I'm not entirely sure, but I would assume it's something to do with the poisonous planet and stopping that getting into their clothes, or to stop things like trouser snakes from getting up there. However you want to look at it, this is by far the most boring step and most fiddly, trying to get the tape through the legs without it sticking. So, just good luck. To keep going with that, it's worth it in the end. What I will advise is just a blob of super glue on the end of the masking tape, otherwise at some point later on that is going to come undone. And here we are with the first and most boring step complete. There are no trouser snakes getting in or out of there. And on a similar subject, I'll take out my ruler and just show you how tall these guys are. From base to helmet, they are just under 5 centimeters, which I understand is bigger than what most of you are going to be playing with, but these same techniques can be adapted and used on smaller figures too. So for the trench coats, we're going to take a piece of masking tape and fold it in half. And unfortunately, there's no real easy way around this. If the soldiers you're using, like mine, have lots of little packs and bits and bobs around their belts, you've got 2 choices. It's either a case of cutting them off, or you're going to have to just keep measuring and cutting bits off using trial and error until you get something that seems right. I didn't want to cut all the little packs off because the models I've seen are carrying lots of random bits and bobs around. I just think it gives the models a lot more character. So even at 15 times speed here, you can see that this does take lots of trial and error. There's no way I'm going to stick the trench coats onto the figures just yet, because that's going to really mess with my chi when it comes to trying to paint them. So what I have done is numbered each of the models and in pencil just written on the trench coat which one belongs to which I'm going to commend myself for, because normally I get to that point later and realise I've made a terrible mistake. Originally for the shoulder pads I was just going to use hammer beads, as you saw on that prototype model. But I knew I wasn't very happy with it, so what I did is these roll plugs that I used in the last video for the Dreadnought. In that video I used them as exhaust pipes. But as you can see here on the end, they've got this nice rounded edge and it's already split into 2. So what I'm going to do is just cut off the ends of those to form the shoulder pads. And with that done, all we need to do is simply cut out a right angled segment of each soldier's shoulder. Cut out a right angled segment of each soldier's shoulder, which luckily for you is a lot easier to do than it is to say. And then if you've been following along, you'll have a group of guys that look a bit like this. I do feel I misjudged the size of the shoulder pads a little bit here. They seem to sit a bit too high on the model. I didn't change them, and you can see at the end that it's not really noticeable, but you might just want to take that into account when you're making them yourself. So with all the boring stuff out of the way, this is it, the bit you've all been waiting for, how we make the actual gas masks. So you can find these light up spiky rubber balls in shops for about £1. And as you only need one of these spikes for each mask, then you can see that you've got more than enough on one ball to make an entire army. This technique would also be good for making plague doctors or even old world pilgrim or witch hunter type hats. I also intend to use them as traffic cones for gaslands. And if you're working at a smaller, maybe 28mm scale, you can still just cut down the cone to whatever size you need it to be in order to fit the model's face. So that gives you two options. The first one, as I'm doing here, is I'm going to cut the model's face off. This is in no way a reference to the Nicolas Cage, John Travolta film. Though as I'm saying it, I'm thinking what great role-playing opportunities that would provide in a tabletop game. But back to this, it's purely just to give a flat surface to be able to glue the cone onto. And of the two methods I use here, this is actually my preferred. And one idea this did give me as I was doing it is these thin slithers of face do look really creepy, and they could be used for decorating kind of chaos armor, tanks. I don't know if Fabius Bile is still a character these days, but back in the day, it would have been great decoration for that. I think that would fit really well into a lot of the darker games that are out there at the minute. Something like Trench Crusade seems perfect for that kind of decoration. And then just sizing it up. One thing I did notice is if you cut the bottom of the cone at a slight angle, then it allows it to just point down slightly rather than pointing straight forward, which is a mistake I made the first time. I used hot glue for this part because I wanted the glue to be able to fill up any gaps in the mask and the helmet. It also gave me the ability to just tweak the angle of that mask so I can make sure it's pointing down in the position that I want. But I tried to be very careful not to put too much, which is what I usually end up doing, because I didn't want it all squeezing out of the sides and having that bulge around the side of the mask. And for most of these models, that actually worked quite well. With this guy, you can see I did the same thing, only I hadn't cut the face off first. I just tried to use the glue to cover around that area. And I still think that worked quite well with these guys with their helmets. The Commissar, it's a bit more obvious that I tried to cheat there. But my advice would be just to cut the faces off, which is why I went back to doing it for the rest of the squad here. And like I said, keep the faces. They make great decoration for later projects, or if you want to do basing on the models, which I don't tend to do, but having faces pressed into the mud might also be quite effective. This guy was just slightly different because his face is pressed up against the gun here. I just cut out the cone as I did, but then had to cut it, I'd say in half, but slightly over half, just to kind of fit around the gun there. And once it was all complete, stuck on and painted, again, that looked fine. You couldn't really tell there was any problems there. The Commissar, you might notice at the end, it's quite obvious he has just got a cone stuck to the front of his face. I did mean to paint straps around, because you can still see his ears, and completely forgot about that at the end of it all. I really should have cut his face off flat like I did with everyone else, and it also would have then fitted under the peak of his cap better, which emphasising the front of the Commissar's cap would be quite good. When I was planning this all out in my head, I decided I was going to use the hammer beads that I've used in quite a few videos to make the thin slithers for the eye rings. When I tried that for the prototype guy that I showed you earlier, I realized that the hammer beads are just way too overscaled, especially if you're going to start using smaller scales like 28 or 32mm. So scouring the house for a plastic tube that anyone would be able to find around their homes was difficult, but then I came up with this, the humble Bic pen. If you're going to do this, make sure you use one that's pretty much empty, because this ink gets everywhere, it stains everything, and it's impossible to wash out. Here I just cut out and threw away any bits that had ink still in them and just used a clean tube, and that worked out really well. So for each mask you want to cut two very thin slithers of this tube to form the eye portal holes, and one that's just slightly longer, which is going to be what I presume is a filter at the end of the mask that connects to the hose. Make sure you keep an eye on these things, no pun intended, but they are very losable. And here we come to the part where the difficulty check is far too high for my dexterity skill, and whichever greater power up there is rolling my dice keeps getting fumbles. So I'll just show you the one edit that I managed to do without too much faffing about, and then we can just move swiftly on. As stated, you want two of the thinner rings to be the eye holes, and one that is slightly longer, which actually just slides quite nicely onto the end of the cone here, to be the filter stroke connection. And as we come to the point here where I glue them onto the poker chips that I use for bases, you might be forgiven for thinking that I'm going to regret not writing the number on the bottom of the poker chips, but don't worry, I'm way ahead of you. I've already written it. Sometimes I even surprise myself. To keep everything quick and easy, I spray painted the soldiers in the garden, and whilst I was waiting for them to dry, I decided to paint the inside, well, what I thought was going to be the inside of their trench coats, because I thought I could just stick them on then and glue the model all as one piece. Turns out I actually painted the outside of the trench coats, so I had to rethink all of that anyway. So if you do consider doing something similar to this, just make sure you know which side's which. I'm just using a cheap acrylic craft paint here from the local shop, and it didn't go on to the masking tape very well at all. Also, when it came time to do the wash at the end, this did bring off some of the painted surface, so I had to touch that up afterwards. I would imagine that if you use a decent model paint, then you wouldn't have this same problem. But if you want to see a much better video on using masking tape for models and painting them, then there is a channel called Peach's Tips that does some great videos, and I would strongly implore you to look there. I might even try and add a link in the description. And here they are, all undercoated in black and ready to go, and looking mighty fine if I do say so myself. So for the boots, bandages and gas masks, I wanted a brown, at least base coat for them. Here just a cheap brown acrylic paint from Hobbycraft, and as well as the boots, bandages and mask, I also gave an undercoat of brown to the helmet and the shoulder pads. This was the first one I painted, so I also did his pouches, packs, belts, straps, those kind of things, but don't do those yet because we need to paint the rest of the uniform first, and then we're just going to end up having to do that all over again later. I'm sure there's a lot of people watching this that probably already knew that that was coming anyway. For the dry brush stroke overbrush of the mask, bandages and boots, I mixed a white and brown, from light brown, just added a touch of that cheap mustardy kind of yellow as well. And whether through look or design, that actually turned out to be quite a nice colour. I'm quite happy with that. And as you can see, I'd learned by the time I'd finished the first one not to bother with the packs and straps and things for the others, so just work through the rest of the squad. So for the trousers, I decided just to use this Army Painter Army Green, just because I didn't want the models to be entirely dressed in grey. I just wanted a little bit of colour variation in there. I also just mixed a bit of white in with this, just to give it a quick dry brush as well, just to bring out some of the colours and details in the trouser legs. I was so excited about this project that I actually went to my local gaming shop, which is called Grim Dice and is in Grimsby here in the UK. And was met with complete decision paralysis at the sheer number of shades of different paints and types of different paints, like washes and quick paints and layers and all sorts of things that I didn't understand. What I wanted was just a basic grey paint with a slight bluish colour. So in this video here, it does look like the kind of colour that I wanted, but in actual real life it's not quite as blue as it seems to look here. It's more of just a kind of standard grey. This is where I realised I'd actually painted the outside of the coats and not the inside as I'd hoped, so I had to repaint that, but I did it all with the grey as well. To me, painting all of this separate just seemed to make a lot more sense, and would be a lot less fiddly, a lot less hassle trying to paint the inside of the legs and coat once they were all stuck together. So for this I used hot glue, and again that was to give me a little bit of time, just a few seconds to make sure it's definitely in the right place before it sticks, and using the hot glue to hopefully allowing the hot glue to hopefully fill any just little gaps and inconsistencies. Obviously with this being masking tape, it's not going to be the most natural looking or laying fabric material, but for keeping things cheap and easy, I think this technique actually worked really, really well. Like I said, Peach's Tips channel does some really good stuff with masking tape. You should have a look over that. But otherwise, this is just a case of cutting it as best you can and just trying to make it lay as nice as you can when you're attaching it. So once the masking tape trench coats were in place, I just went over with another coat of the blue-grey in order to bring them both together and not make the line between them so obvious. In another example of my poor planning and lack of forethought, I painted the Commissar's trench coat the blue-grey as well, so there you just see me having to repaint that black. Then I mixed the blue-grey with a white in order to create a dry brush, bring out the highlights and try to emphasize some of the lines of the coat just to make it look a little bit more natural. Once that's all done, then we come back to the brown details, the straps, packs, holsters. And for the Commissar 2, I didn't put him in strict Commissar garb. I gave him some similar details to these guys just because I wanted it to be obvious they were all part of the same squad. And then just go over all of those with a lighter brown dry brush to bring out any more details there. And just to finish off any of the metal details using silver just as a dry brush overbrush, because I still wanted some of that brown to show through to show that it was still very kind of muddy, dirty armor. And that's the soldiers themselves basically done. As I'm voicing over here, I can see only two things that are missing. So when I looked at some images for reference, I noticed they all have big heavy backpacks. So for that, I'm going to use just this block of foam. It was getting late in the day here, so this bit is really rushed. If I could do this again, I would maybe add a few more kind of curves to the cuts just to make them look a little bit more natural, less squared edges. For the sleeping bags and bedrolls, I was going to use a thinner foam, but that was just too thick still, so I rolled up some masking tape here. I also made some little masking tape straps just to make it look like they were actually attached to the backpacks. And then I just started adding these small different random shapes to the backpacks, again completely randomly, just to make each one a little bit more individual. And they turned out okay. As you can see, they would have benefited a lot more from just some kind of edges being taken off them, just some simple cuts with the Stanley blade just to soften them a little bit. But once they're all done, paint them brown, and then I give them a dry brush over of a lighter brown just to bring out the edging details. Then back to the hot glue and just sticking these to their backs. Luckily, they've already got the brown straps painted on, almost as if I'd planned it. So it looks quite natural that the backpacks would be there, not just like it's just being randomly glued on. Luckily, I just remembered I needed to paint the gloves and some little details black again, and then adding some small red details to Commissar Trench's uniform, which I actually did surprisingly well, if I do say so myself. Normally, I would go for a Sharpie for this kind of detail, as I hate painting lines, but the Sharpie wasn't going to work over the black, so paintbrush it was. It would have been very simple to add some small embellishments to the backpacks here just to make them look a little bit more realistic. But just through pure laziness, I didn't do that, so I just used a Sharpie to suggest. I did add some gold trim to Commissar Trench's trench coat with a gold Sharpie, just because he likes to feel pretty sometimes, as we all do. Creating a brown wash with a small amount of brown paint, water, and a touch of washing up liquid. And then I just completely hammer these guys with it in the same way that cowboy builder damp-proofed my living room. So taking a look, reflecting on where we've been and where we're at, I'm really happy with the way these guys turned out. I'm not happy at all with the backpacks, but obviously we've been through that and you know how to do that better next time. Other than that, I'd be really proud to field these guys on any battlefield. I do have an idea for a scenario coming up where there will be people entering a restricted zone, and I would quite like to use these as kind of wasteland scavengers within the restricted zone. So there's just one last detail to add, and I think it's the one that really makes them stand out from other models. I've saved this till the end because I didn't want it having to be painted and then repainted. I thought this is just going to be black anyway, so this could just go right on once everything else is done. There's lots of options you can use for this wire, but here I've just used the cable from some old headphones. It seems to fit the scale quite well. One end can fit quite snugly into that filter connector on the end of the mask, and then the other end can just be glued wherever would seem appropriate. Obviously into the brown packs, there could be some kind of filtration system or oxygen canister within those, but otherwise Just kind of wherever there's a nook or a cranny where it would fit quite nicely and be able to hold and strengthen the glue. And that brings us to the glamour shots. These guys are very kind of iconic looking. They can be used in a lot of games that are popular at the minute. So anything from your 40k Death Korps to Trench Crusade, which is massive at the minute. I think these guys look like the Heretics. But any kind of trench warfare, World War I, diesel punk, Fallout, post-apocalyptic game, these guys have got that vibe. You can use these same mask techniques for lots of different things. Like I've said, plague doctors, any kind of Nurgle, plague marine, maybe even some kind of zombie apocalypse kind of survival games, which is similar to the restricted zone kind of zombies that I'm going to be fielding in an upcoming game I have planned. So at this point, I just want to say thank you very much for watching. If you're still around now, I really do appreciate all the support I've had since I've started this channel, people commenting and giving me tips and advice myself, because often I come into this only half knowing something, and then people will kind of explain in the comments why certain things are the way they are. This hobby has such a supportive, kind and helpful community, and I really couldn't be any happier with how this channel's grown. If you have benefited in any way from this video or any of my other videos, then I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing. Please drop me a comment if you have any suggestions, questions, advice, things you'd like me to try and tackle in upcoming videos. But other than that, until next time, please continue to look after yourselves, look after each other, and keep on being cheap and easy.